Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Ray Lindley. I'm pleased to welcome you to this workshop today. And we have had so many good comments about the last time that Dr. Jennifer Hill uh, presented for us. And I'm especially excited about today's topic because one of the things that I think teachers have can all get more help is how to construct measurements. Testing, we call them testing, but we're really trying to measure students' knowledge and their acquisition of the things that we're trying to instill in them. So this is an exciting topic for us today, and really happy to welcome you all. And Dr. Jake he's the big guy now. Um he's the executive director, and I'm taking a seat as the president of the organization. So we still work very, very closely together. But Dr. Jake has done a tremendous job in furthering the cause of Array Global. So Dr. Jake, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you on this Saturday among our educator brothers and sisters, trying to improve and grow and be better administrators, be better teachers. And so we're excited to be able to have this topic with you today. Before we get into the presentation, just a few different announcements. We're really excited for Array Global to announce that we have been formally approved by the Florida State Board of Education. And most importantly, for many of those schools there, we've been approved by the Florida High School Athletic Association, which many high schools in the United States, that's a very important part of that. We also like to announce that this past week we were approved by this in the state of Iowa. So we're excited about that to be able to provide our services to many, many schools in that state. And we're approved in many states in the United States, but we're just excited as we continue to grow and develop. And we have been working with many schools in your countries, not just in the United States, but we have several schools in Saudi Arabia and throughout the Middle East. And we'd be excited to meet and work with any of you if you're interested to discuss Array Global Accreditation in your school, if you're not already part of our organization. A few different things about today's workshop. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and we'll try to politely intervene and ask those questions to Dr. Jennifer. So please make sure that you post those in the chat. And at the end, when we're filling out the survey, you'll have a chance to even raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask any questions if you're brave enough to do so instead of being on the chat. And with that, at the very end of the workshop is when we post our survey. And that survey is the only way that we have to track if you have participated. And so what we require of you is to write down a few different things that you can take from today's workshop into your classroom tomorrow or Monday, whenever your school week does start. So take a few different notes. That'll be on the survey. It's a quick survey. And then later next week, we will send out certificates. And those certificates are great for you to be able to show your administration and your parents that you're continually improving and growing as an educator. A few different activities that we have coming up. One that's really exciting that ends in 1 week. It is our photo contest, our art contest, and this year it's photography. And so we would encourage you to get onto our website and get your students involved into our art contest. We always have hundreds and hundreds of students that participate, and we'd love to have your school also participate. It's free, and your students will get certificates for participation. And then our judges have a hard time going through all the different entries because there's so many good entries, and we choose the best ones. And out of those best ones, there's some cash prizes for first place, our grand prize, and then first place in each grade category. So I will post that in the chat about that academic contest here in a few minutes. And then also, starting February 1st, when our art contest closes, we open up our world-renowned science contest, our Stella Science Fair. And we encourage you to get your students involved. We always have so much interest for our science fair. So we'd love to have your school participate. And it works the same way as our art contest, where we have a grand prize winner. We have grade categories where we have a first place, second place, third place, and often do honorable mentions. And we give out certificates. Your students would record themselves for 1 or 2 minutes about some kind of a science project that they were able to do. And we have kindergartners that participate in this all the way up to grade 12. So we want all of your students to participate. And the great thing is, it's free. Another thing we wanted to announce is that our next workshop is March 21st, and we're really excited to have a professor with us. We have a professor with us today, Dr. Jennifer, but we'll have another professor with us whose speciality is artificial intelligence and how to best integrate that and utilize that in your classroom and in your school so it can maximize your time and efficiency and engage students too. Because artificial intelligence is part of us in our day-to-day activities now. It's starting to change a lot of things of what we do and how we do that. So please get onto our website, check out the great services that we have, and we'd be love to talk to you if you're not part of our organization, talk to you and your administration about how we can best support your school in its improvement process. So with that, Dr. Ray, if you have anything else to add, I'll turn it back to you.
I'm doing well and excited for today. And so I think we should get on with Dr. Jennifer.
Well, hello, everyone. It is late morning here in my area of the Pacific Northwest in the United States, and it's just a joy and a privilege for me to be able to join with you. I just want to double check, Dr. Jake, are you able to see my slides now that I've started
Yep.
sharing?
Yep. Works
Perfect.
great.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, first, I just want to share with you that today's information actually comes from a long document that was created about 25 years ago from the Kansas State Department of Education. And I have the title there because it is available open access as a free download. It's called, Is This a Trick Question? A Short Guide to Writing Effective Test Questions. And I love to be able to share resources with you that are free and available. And so just know that this is a summary of that document specifically and some best practices in the area of assessment. I have a little bit about my experiences in education there on the slide for you. I've been a high school English teacher and school counselor both here and internationally. We lived in South Korea for a few years, and then I got to come back and rejoin my alma mater and really focus on secondary education. Specifically, I teach methods classes and literacy classes and working with multilingual learners. And so as we think about assessment today, obviously there are entire classes and graduate programs just on assessment. And so I struggled a little bit with the best ways to summarize some things for you, but just want to give you some key ideas that hopefully you can take back with you again into your classrooms right away. And I know that we have a tremendous group of educators that are here. First, I just want to thank you for all that you do for students. Our love and care for our students, excuse me, across the world is really what unites us. And so it is so inspiring for me to be in this group this morning and just share with you some things to help refine your practice, possibly think about some things in a new way, or maybe just confirm what you were already doing, because we know that some of our programs come with some mandated assessments that are created for us. I worked in an international baccalaureate school in South Korea. And so some of those things are already made, but the work of an educator is quite often coming up with your own assessments or refining assessments. So our goal today specifically is to review the important characteristics of quality test construction and what that looks like. We're going to focus, there are a lot of different areas, obviously, in assessment, but we're going to focus today specifically on multiple choice, true, false, matching, completion, and essay. and then talk about the advantages and disadvantages and characteristics of well-designed assessment questions. And as we're going through these things today, I have to tell you that I was an English teacher, of course. So as a student, essays were really easy for me. But true, false, and multiple choice, I just struggled with as a student. And thinking back to even some of those days, my teachers would tell me that I was overthinking the questions. You're thinking too much. And I remember thinking, well, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Aren't I supposed to think about these things? And thinking, I don't think that that's a bad thing. But sometimes in the way that we design assessment questions, students really feel like it could be a trick question. They're not quite sure how to interpret things. And so the goal is to really think about well-written tests measuring learning and not luck specifically. We want to know what our students know, understand, and are able to do, not just how well they are at how equipped they are at guessing the correct choices on different types of exams. And so the goal today is to really take some of that luck and guesswork and tricky questions out and try to make assessment just as clear as possible for our students. So just in general, and again, many of these things I'm sure are review to you, but we know that the longer the test, the more accurate the measure can be. Short tests tend to sometimes not cover everything that students understand, but long tests can also have fatigue that comes into them. And so thinking about the appropriate test length for your students, both for content and for their developmental level, becomes really important. Clear, concise instructions are key. What do you want students to do? Are they circling the right answer? Are they writing it off to the side? Are they doing something different, especially if you're using a different device to assess students, making sure that those directions are important in every section of that exam. And then mixing it up. I already told you true false were the worst for me. And so if I knew I had a entirely true false question or a true false exam, that would just make me more nervous than anything. So coming up with some different variety of things in our testing can be really important. And that also helps students that maybe struggle with one area of assessment but not another be able to see what they really know. And then, of course, testing early, testing frequently is important. We don't want our students to stress about the exams that are coming up. The more that they get used to the styles and the predictability, that, of course, lowers their anxiety quite a bit. Checking for accuracy is important. The worst thing, I think, as a teacher is to realize later on that you have an error in your test or even an error in your key in the ways that you're grading those. And so that accuracy is important early on. Proofreading carefully. Having one wrong answer is, as you think about testing, and I'm going to mention this specifically in the area of math, and I was not a math teacher, but I am married to a math teacher. And I know that the struggle in math specifically is what happens if they make a mistake in solving an equation early on, and then they're actually able to solve the entire equation using the correct steps, but because they have one number wrong, that makes the entire question wrong. And so thinking about how can you isolate some of those areas specifically if there is an error that happens early on, is the entire question wrong or not? And my husband would chime in there and say that's why partial points are important, but thinking about what is the wrong answer and how are you going to measure that? And then I want to add in there special considerations as well. I'll have some tips for you later on, thinking of our students that have learning difficulties or our multilingual learners specifically, and ways to think about the ways in which we construct those assessments for them. The last bullet point that I have there is a little humor. I also, as a school counselor, work with a lot of kids that have test anxiety. And you probably know this already, but one of the best ways to ease some of that anxiety early on is to actually ask a funny question. ask an easy question in your first 2 or 3 questions on an exam. That lowers the anxiety level for students. It's also, honestly, if they're in the room with you, it's fun to hear them chuckle a little bit, right? When they get to that funny question. But even just adding a little bit of humor can really help students lower their test anxiety specifically, and will help them be more successful on the exam overall, because they've relaxed a little bit as they begin, because we know how much stress goes into those testing situations. And again, not just for older students, but younger students as well. So today we're going to talk about 2 categories of test items: objective items and subjective or essay tests specifically. The truth is, it is much easier to grade an essay. It's easier to write an essay test question, but much more difficult to grade it, right? Where we see the opposite coming in with objective items. They're faster to grade. You can click through those pretty quickly, or even your grading program can click through it pretty quickly. But the writing of those test items takes much longer. And so today we're going to spend the majority of time looking at multiple choice, true, false, matching, and completion, because those can be tricky to write. And again, we want to take that trickiness out for our students specifically as they look at those items of assessment. So thinking about when to use each type is important, right? What is it specifically that we're going to assess? What were our learning objectives? What is the best way to know what students know? And of course, as you know, when I say, do you understand? And students nod their heads, that actually doesn't tell me a thing, right? Other than the fact that they can nod their head. It doesn't actually tell me what they know. And so that's where assessment becomes such an important piece. But determining what type of assessment we're going to use is also really key in the process. So objective type tests are appropriate when the group to be tested is large and the test may be reused. Highly reliable scores must be obtained as efficiently as possible. A lot of times with older students, we see these in final exams that have to be scored quickly. We also see these obviously in standardized testing for groups or schools, countries, or states. And then also objective tests are helpful when we need impartiality of evaluation, fairness, and freedom from possible test scoring influences. And it's a way we could have an entire session just talking about test bias, but obviously the more objective the questions, the easier it is to remove that bias. But we also always have to be thinking about it and making sure that that is not something that the bias is getting in the way of measuring whether or not the student knows the information, just even in the ways that we're asking questions and what specifically we're testing about. Subjective or essay tests are appropriate when the group to be tested is small and the test is not to be reused. And so this, of course, is tricky. If you were to use the exact same question from one year to the next, students get pretty good at sharing those questions with each other, being able to look things up ahead of time. Also, if you wish to encourage and reward the development of student skill in writing, and again, this is a whole nother area that we could jump into, but we want to make sure that when we are assessing students, we're not just assessing whether or not they're a good writer. We're trying to assess their learning specifically. And so you always have to keep that in mind when you're looking at some type of an essay exam or an essay piece that's part of a larger test. And when you're more interested in exploring the student's attitudes and ideas than in measuring his or her achievement, these open-ended pieces allow us to be able to really get inside their heads a little bit and know what it is that they're thinking about the content, as opposed to just a black and white, yes or no, right or wrong question. Then we know that either subjective essay tests or objective tests can be used to measure almost any important educational achievement that a written test can measure. I'm going to adjust my second monitor here just a moment. When to test understanding and apply principles, and the ability to apply principles, test the ability to think critically, and test the ability to solve problems. And so, of course, we are in In a world where testing becomes very important, it also is very challenging in order to do that appropriately and accurately and be able to give our students really good feedback about what they've learned. And then, of course, there are stakeholders beyond just the students themselves, their parents and schools, and again, possibly state or country may also be interested in the results of those exams. So when we think about test items themselves, these are some things to consider. Test items should, and this is again a broad umbrella, assess achievement of instructional objectives, measure important aspects of the subject, accurately reflect the emphasis placed on important aspects of instruction, measure an appropriate level of student knowledge, and then vary in levels of difficulty. So we want to make sure, of course, we're going to jump into Bloom's here in a minute, but we want to make sure that we are looking at those test items varying, not just in the variety of the types of things that we ask, but they're also varied in their level of difficulty and complexity specifically. And this is where Bloom's can come in a very nice way. And of course, we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy and the different ways of understanding specifically for students. And you'll see this list here of Bloom's items: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And depending on what we are testing on, of course, the questions look different. So if we're testing on just a basic knowledge level or depth of knowledge, level 1, then those questions are going to be things like, who invented the blank? Where is the blank? What is meant by the blank? Just basic knowledge level for students. And then as we continue to look at their understanding and watch that grow, then those questions deepen into the comprehension and application areas, where we can ask questions like, restate in your own words, how is blank an example of blank? Why is this significant? And really causing them to more critically think about the content of which they've learned. Typically, we see things, objective questions and objective exams are able to measure some of the earlier areas: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis. And typically we see other things, other types of exams and perhaps more authentic assessment come out in analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, because those are going to take longer for students specifically, even though there are some ways to write objective questions using some of those areas. Here are some examples. What ideas can you add to? Do you agree? How would you decide about? What priority would you give? Again, those are areas that are more suited towards actually having essay type or short answer or those types of things, because they're harder to really gather with multiple choice and true false type questions. But there are still some ways in which you can do that, and we'll look at those. So when we're going to jump now into specific. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. There's a great question from Dr. Sarah Mosen from a wonderful school, and it's about assessments, especially with non-English speakers. She says that sometimes we have some difficulty in preparing exams specifically for below-level students who can't read well or can't speak fluently. How can we prepare assessments that help us to evaluate them? I thought that was a really thoughtful question, but she's an outstanding educator too, so I'm not too surprised.
Yes, absolutely. So let me, as we move into multiple choice, this is actually one of the easiest areas to make those changes. And so let me actually talk. Thank you for that great question. Let me talk about that in the context of what we're going to talk about next, because really, really important to think about what that looks like. So when we're asking multiple choice type questions, multiple choice, of course, is good for assessing application, analysis, and evaluation, suitable for both factual recall and higher order thinking. And then they can be used when you need broad coverage and objective scoring. They're also, by the way, very difficult to write. So for my pre-service teachers, right now I'm working mainly with college students who are training to be teachers and then student teachers out in the field, I actually have them do a lot of practice in these areas of writing multiple choice questions because they can be very, very difficult to construct. The advantages of them, they're efficient and reliable. They reduce guessing with good distractors. That's key. They can assess many levels of learning. And the disadvantages, as we already noted, time consuming to construct, difficulty writing plausible distractors, and they may appear overly tricky to students specifically. So here are some things to think about when writing those test questions. Write clear, focused stems. We're going to look at an example of that in just a moment. Avoid irrelevant details. That's for two reasons. One of those reasons is because it can distract students, can take them down a path maybe that you weren't intending them to go down. But also, if it's very wordy, specifically when we're talking about our multilingual learners or our struggling readers, they can get lost in the language and maybe we're not even assessing at all their learning. It's their language that becomes the barrier specifically for them. Typically with multiple choice questions, it's recommended, study after study says that 4 or 5 answer choices, so we're talking A, B, C, D, possibly E, really help to analyze what the students really know and if they can be discriminate about those specific distractors. Going back to your question about our struggling readers and our multilingual learners, one of the easiest ways to adapt that specifically is if we have 5 items, let's say, in a multiple choice test question, reduce that down to 3 specifically. And so you're taking out 2. That gives students less to read and helps them not get as lost in the language. You can still analyze then their learning, but they have fewer test questions. And so that's just a really quick one as an example, and I'll be able to give you more along the way. But that is one of the first things that I teach with my students is thinking about making those accommodations on tests. Think about reducing those answer choices is an easy way to begin specifically. And then, of course, avoid using all or none of the above excessively. Students tend to know if all of the above is an answer choice, that usually that is the answer, right? Unless every question has all of the above or none of the above. So be very careful about how often you use that. And then include higher order thinking scenarios or mini type cases, again, to be able to get into those higher levels of blooms with multiple choice specifically. So here are some examples from grade 3, grade 7, high school, and grade 10. These are the types of questions that you are easy to ask over in a multiple choice type setting. And here is a non-example of a poorly written multiple choice question and an improved example. So I'd like for you to take just a minute, take a look at this example that I've given you from grade 5 science and think about the differences between the first example and the improved example. And if you could, would you just jot there in the chat for us, what are some things that are different from the first example compared to the improved example? What has changed? And Dr. Jake, I'm not able to see all the chat. Can you just share with us some of the things that people are writing?
Yeah, they're starting to come in. Muhammad writes the wording is different. The quality. The number 2 is more accurate and more specific. Another Muhammad says. Khalud says the second has critical thinking in it. Dr. Amani says the exact feeding process. So there's probably some learning involved with it. Sarah Talha says improved example is more specific and accurate. Amr says the second question has more details. Mr. Tony, the second example makes use of the vocabulary taught during the lesson. Tadek says it includes the scientific process. Yeah, so a lot of Knight says instead of asking about the part which makes food, in the second question, there's more details given. Hamza says the second one has some critical thinking in it. Let's see. Yeah, there's a lot of really, really good
Yeah,
comments.
those are great, great examples. All of the
Yeah.
above is in that situation, right? All of those things show the improvement specifically in this. And note that the question's still covering the same content, right? It's just you can really see the difference between the first example and the second in how much better that is actually written. I'm also going to note for you just the importance of highlighting or putting in bold or italicizing some key words can be really helpful. So we're thinking about struggling learners again, ML students, but again, all students, right? Having most in bold and through photosynthesis in bold, those keys can help students really understand the question better and really key into the main idea that the test question is asking about. And so thinking about those construction things become very helpful in this question. Again, same answer, right? But it's just a much more well-developed, well-written question. So moving on to true, false, and appropriate use. Again, I already told you my least favorite, but it's helpful to think about these things in putting together true, false questions. They're best for measuring factual knowledge and common misconceptions. They should be used for statements that are absolutely true or absolutely false. That's where it can get difficult, right? Is making sure that no matter which way you look at it, there's an absolute true or an absolute false. Avoid items that can be interpreted differently depending on context. Students, just for timing, students can usually answer 3 to 4 true false or true false questions per minute. And so they also can get through more questions because they tend to be shorter. But because of that, a large number of items are usually needed for higher reliability. We need to be asking more than just a few true or false questions in order to make sure that those test items are reliable. And then the items can be expressed in a few words, making them less dependent upon reading ability. So again, back to your question about reading levels and multilingual learners, true false questions are helpful for those things as well, as long as they're worded correctly. As a side note, before we jump into some examples, one of the things that I have found helpful, both with my high school students and now with my college students and graduate students, when they're taking an exam and they come across any type of objective question, I always give them the opportunity to have a sheet of scratch paper. Usually I provide that scratch paper for them because I want them to know that everyone to reduce cheating, that everyone's using the paper in which I've given them. But I always give them the opportunity, if they have any questions about the ways in which that question was worded, or if they find that there could be possibly two different ways to look at it in ways that I haven't thought about, I always give them an opportunity to explain their reasoning. And so even though it's a true or false question, if they have an explanation that they want me to consider, I always give them the opportunity to write that out. With my multilingual learners, I would give them the opportunity to talk to me about it, not just to express it in writing if necessary. But I found that really helpful, especially the first time or the first few times I was using a new exam that I had written, was to make sure to give them that opportunity. And most of the time it was like, oh, I didn't even think about it in that way. Of course, yes, I'm going to consider this perspective, but in the future, I'm also going to change that test item as well. And so just having students give input with a sheet of scratch paper if they come across problems that are difficult to interpret for them can be really, really helpful. And I just appreciate their feedback in those ways too. The advantage and disadvantages of true false questions: they can be easy to construct and score. They can test broad content quickly. The disadvantages, of course, is there's a high chance of guessing. If there is only a true or false answer, they have a 50% chance in guessing of getting that correct. They can tend to encourage rote memorization, again, because those answer responses tend to be more simple. And true false tends to be difficult to measure complex understanding specifically. Again, they can be helpful for making sure that we're adding variety to our tests and giving students one more way of analyzing information. It's just we don't tend to see true false questions get to those higher levels of Bloom's overall. So here are some tips. Write clear, single statements. Avoid negatives and double negatives. Those are the worst in true false questions. But I do have to say this, use qualifiers to make statements realistic. Things like often, generally, italicize key terms. And I'm going to jump down to this last one because it goes right along with it. Bold, underline, or capitalize words like not that can change the meaning of the question. Because we already said, remember, true false questions are much faster to answer. But because of that, students tend to zoom through them more quickly and they could overlook something like the word not that could completely change their answer. And so making sure that it's not becoming a reading issue, but that that's really clear in the ways that those are written. And then, of course, keeping true and false items similar in length and avoid lifting sentences directly from the text. So students, especially those that are really good at memorizing, have to pause and think about those questions for a moment. Here's some more examples from across different grade levels. Specifically, we're going all the way from grade 2 reading to high school chemistry and looking at typical true false type questions. I'm going to pause for just a second so you can look at those.
We do have some other questions too, whenever you want to take some more.
Okay, perfect. Let me get to this next example. Great. And then we'll go back. How about?
Yep.
So as you can see, all short, there are key terms like all, and students can read through them rather quickly. Here, let's look again at a non-example, and then we'll pause and go back to your questions. So here's a grade 6 social studies question and the improved example. So just like we did before, if you would, as you go through there, what changed from the weaker example to the stronger example? What do you see there? And again, notice the second example is still relatively short. It's a little bit longer than the first, but still a very short sentence. Dr. Jake, could you read us some of those comments that participants are making?
Yeah. The second one, Khalud says the second one's very clear. Amr says the second example, the key words are highlighted for easier answers. Aubrey says the important words are highlighted. Sabrina says the second sentence words are in bold. Dr. Amani, never use only. It gives away the answer. That's a good one. I've used that one, I know. Let's see. Muhammad says the second one hints that there are many reasons. Muhammad says elaborate with reason. Noha says the key words are highlighted in the second. However, the meaning in the first and second examples are different. Yes, a lot of good thoughts there.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for thinking about those and analyzing. I find honestly that sometimes non-examples are the easiest things to learn from, because for us even that invokes our critical thinking about what makes something better, and then the hope is, of course, to be able to apply that into our own assessment writing. So this is a great time for questions, and I heard that there are some. So what are some questions that I can answer or additional things that we can talk about?
Here's one example.
Here's one you might want to tackle and you might not want to. Dr. Jennifer. Actually, Mona says, excuse me, here it is. American Christian School says, what do you think about asking AI to create the exams for you? That's a very current issue.
It is. Um, I I would, my guidance there would be, and I talk about this with my students as well. It can be a good starting place. I don't think that AI, and I'm so glad that in March you're going to be talking about that with this group, because I don't think that AI should ever be our ending place. And but it can give us some really good ideas. Again, however, remember that uh, AI is flawed, and so we never want to use those as kind of an end all and have them generate those questions. And truthfully, I think, wow, AI was not sitting in my classroom while I was teaching these learning objectives. And so it doesn't know exactly where we were getting with maybe some of the key ideas or points. And so while I might use that as a starting place, I never want it to be an ending place, because it's really easy for me to give up ownership of the content to a compute. Well, I don't want it to be easy to give up the content to a computer, right? Or a bot that's generating things. I was in that classroom with my student and with my groups of students, and was part of the learning experience for them. And so I hate to use it as a shortcut. I think it can be easy to fall into the time it saves us to use AI, but I would encourage you to think about it as a starting place to generate ideas, but not an ending place. And again, so glad you're going to have this topic, because that's like a 2-minute answer. And we could jump into that a lot more. But I don't think, I'm not completely anti AI. It's a good place to start. I have concerns with saying, oh, this is a better test question than I could write, because we're also not giving ourselves the credit that we deserve for the expertise that we have as well. So don't forget that you have a lot of knowledge, and you were in the classroom as the learning was happening, and AI was not. Other
Well,
questions?
and that's an important point because AI does not know what you've been doing in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
They have a general concept of the subject, and uh, I think that we have to be especially careful because there are things as a teacher that you will emphasize or do which would not necessarily be covered in AI. And I agree that AI has really helped us in many ways, but it has also hampered our ability as teachers in many ways because they're making assumptions based on it. It reminds me too of being very careful, and I don't know, Dr. Jennifer, you're going to get into this, but being very careful about using textbook publisher exams. They will always say, hey, we'll not only give you the textbook, we'll give you an outline and we'll provide the exams for your students. And that's dangerous
Mm-hmm.
because they do not know what's going on in the classroom.
And I know that AI is getting better all the time, but still, even at that, I never want to take and discount that the professionalism and the training that we have, and our knowledge of students and knowledge of content as well, because you are one of the most important players in the process of that student's education, and and a computer just can't replace you in any way, that's for sure. Any other questions along this area before we move on?
Yeah, specifically about the true false, because that's what you're focusing on right now. And Mr. Tony asks, and this is a great question. He says, I see teachers who use true false questions to ask students to correct the part that is not correct. Can you comment on this strategy?
Correct the part that is
Yeah,
not.
so if it's a false, if you're doing a true false question and it's false, then the students have to correct it.
Oh, and actually that is a great way to approach true false. Obviously, that then lends itself to more of subjective test item as opposed to just objective, where there's just that true or false answer. But that actually significantly raises their level of understanding, or at least your ability to measure their understanding specifically there, because it requires them to think more critically about the question itself and what that looks like. And so definitely that is a masterful approach to looking at those questions too. Thank you so much for that example.
Good.
All right, well, we're going to talk about a couple of other types. Again, I find that multiple choice and true false are the ones that we tend to use the most on objective type questions or objective assessments, but want to give you some keys for other types as well. So the appropriate uses for matching on an objective test is they're best for measuring associations, terms, definitions, vocabulary, people, formulas, dates, those types of things. And then they're also ideal for content requiring the recall of relationships as well. There aren't, not every learning content would be appropriate to assess with matching, but there are some ways in which we can use that. The advantages, it's efficient for testing large amounts of factual information. It's easy to construct and score. Disadvantages, limited to simple recall. It can encourage memorization rather than understanding. And of course, students may guess. And I know as a student, it was always really nice to get down to the last one, because then I knew which one it had to be, right? If we're not having, let's say, for example, 5 items that we're matching and 6 categories that we're choosing from. Otherwise, if it's just 5 and 5, actually guessing can really come into play there specifically. So what are some tips then for writing matching questions? Use the same categories of items in the list. Keep response lists shorter, 5 or 10 items per set. I just always cringe when I see like a list of 20 matching items, because it's so many. And we're going to talk about struggling learners here too, but that can get really daunting for our struggling readers. Provide clear directions. Can an option be used more than once? Are they just drawing a line? What does that need to look like? And then I'm going to show you an example, but arrange responses logically, either alphabetically or chronologically, with the longer text on the left. So here are some examples, but I actually want to jump here to this idea first before we talk about that. So what that means then specifically, a couple of things here in the example. We were talking about our struggling readers or our multilingual students. If you have the longer text to the left, then that actually shortens the amount of reading that students have to do. So for example, in this first item where the terms are here and the responses are here, you actually have to read through those responses many more times in order to find the correct items. Whereas if we have the longer text to the left, that actually helps our struggling readers and our ML students specifically in what it is that they are reading. And note too that having these items that are specifically alphabetized or even in chronological order can help as well, because we're trying to actually measure what students know and understand, not just their reading abilities. So jump back. Examples of matching. I'm sure you can think of some in your own content. Grade 5, match the state to its capital. Grade 8, match authors to their famous works. High school biology, match organelles with their functions specifically. And then I'll go back to this example and non-example. So I've already given you some ideas, but I wanted to use those as I was emphasizing the points. Would you please take a look at the improved example and the first example? And just like what we've done before, what has changed here? What makes it improved versus our first grade 4 math example?
I'll let you know when we have some comments coming in, but I
Super,
like
thank
these
you.
these different comparisons because I think it makes us really think on how we develop our assessments. Because
Hmm.
going back to AI could throw in the first one, the first example, which might be a good start for a teacher to then refine it a little bit more and make it
Hmm.
even better
Hmm.
for students. So I really like that. says the second is giving more details with highlighted clues. Knight is also saying more detailed information is given. Fascia says improved one tells them what is required. So the mid quickly jumps to the answer, which makes it easy for students to answer. So they can find the information much easier and understand it. Muhammad says some technical words are included. Clovis says the longer text is on the left and the shorter on the right. And I noticed that too, Clovis. I'm like, oh yeah, there's probably a specific reason for that.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it does again for our readers, our struggling readers, it does make a huge difference. So I would encourage you. That's probably the thing that I see the most as I'm looking at different assessments that are out there, and promise you, just even making that one change will really help your students. So think about that. Longer on the
Hmm.
left, shorter on the right, and then alphabetize or put in chronological order or however you want to do that so it's easier to sort through that list when you're looking for the right answer. Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and move on quickly through just a couple of other things to think about. Completion items are also very appropriate for an objective type test. We use those when measuring recall of specific facts, terms, or short phrases. These tend to be best for vocabulary, formulas, or definitions. They're easy to write, they help reduce guessing, and they measure recall directly. But the disadvantages, of course, are the scoring can be subjective if the answers vary. Grammar or wording may cue the answer. That could be the difference between like a or an as far as what word needs to come next. And then poorly written items can confuse students. So here are a couple tips for you. Keep blanks towards the end of statements. Use only one blank per item. Avoid too many blanks. Ensure only one correct answer fits. And then again, avoid lifting phrases directly from the readings because this raises the level of critical thinking for students. Here are some specific examples, and you'll see those lines, recall lines aren't very short, are shorter on this just for the point of example. You'd make that longer for students, obviously, to be able to write. And again, let's take a look at this example. So we have a high school chemistry example. The first is a poorer example than the improved example. Take a look at what the differences are between these two. And as what you've done before, if you would just jot a couple of ideas in the chat. What's the difference?
Mustafa says the second is clearer than the first. Fasiha says it's to the point. Clovis, the key text is highlighted in the improved example. Yeah, and then second one is detailed and to the point. It's specific. Um, Amin says a clue is given in the second case. Amr says the second example asks for a specific answer and with highlighted words. Yeah, a
Great,
lot of good
thank you.
comments coming in.
Well, I know that I'm going to go ahead because we'll be sending these slides out to you specifically. There are some more ideas about appropriate uses of essays, advantages and disadvantages, and then some writing tips as well. That can be a whole nother topic for a different day, of course, and thinking about writing essay type questions and what those look like. But a couple final thoughts for you, just in thinking about overall writing assessment questions and how to make sure that we are really writing those questions for to assess learning for our students. Mix question types to balance assessment. Align all items with learning objectives. Again, that's key. Make sure you're measuring what's been taught and that you are measuring in a way that is valid and a way that's reliable. Prioritize clarity and fairness, and then use rubrics and item analysis to refine questions over time. If you've never done an item analysis over the questions on assessments that you've written, it can be really helpful to see what types of questions students miss the most often. Is that because it was just a very complex question, or is it because there was something tricky or difficult to understand in the question itself? So just even for your own professional development and your own assessment practice, thinking about using item analysis can be very helpful for you. If you have a common assessment that, let's say, all of the Algebra 1 teachers are using, doing an item analysis is also very helpful to look at those exams as well. And then again, remember the key from today is that well-written tests should measure learning, not luck. And I hope that today you've been able to, just in our short time together, get a few ideas of specific things that you can take with you into your own assessment writing. And I just want to thank you for the work that you do with students every day and the incredible learning that happens in your classroom, and hope that this information today was valuable to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer. Appreciate all the support and the excellent workshop that you've done for us. Um, in closing, we have a few different things that we do in the closing of our workshops. Uh, After this, Dr. Ray is going to give his words of wisdom, and we usually take those words of wisdom, and you can see them in your Facebook Reels and on YouTube. So make sure that you follow us on YouTube. After he's done with the words of wisdom, we're going to do two things. I'm going to post in the chat the survey so you can fill out and get the certificate next week. And then also during that time, as you're filling it out, we are going to open up time for questions. And I have copied some of the questions from the chat that weren't in the best timing to interrupt. So we'll pose some of those to Dr. Jennifer, and then you're welcome to reach out to us at any time, and we'd be happy to help you and your school in its improvement process and its professional development or anything else. So with that, Dr. Ray, we'll turn it over to Dr. Ray's words of wisdom.
Thank you. When I was thinking about today and the topic that Dr. Jennifer would be discussing today, I was reminded of an incident where I actually met a friend of mine after we had not seen each other for several years. And I knew that he had been a teacher and even an administrator. And he told me that he had been invited back to his high school, the high school reunion of students who were graduated 25 years ago. So he was brought back as somebody they really admired as a teacher. And he said one student came up to him and said, "Thank you so much. You are the best math teacher I have ever had." And he said, "Thank you to her." Then he looked at me and he said, "I didn't teach math. I taught history." But what she said to him was his quality as a teacher. And he learned this important lesson. You don't teach subjects, you teach students. And when you teach students, they're much more likely to learn. And then the anonymous quotation, which I read recently, it says, teaching is not always easy, but it's always worth it." When we see the impact we have on our students, their lives, and when we witness their growth and development, we know that we are doing something meaningful and important. My words for today.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. It's always an inspiration to hear from you and hear those thoughts. So in the chat now, we'll post the workshop survey. Please make sure you fill it out in its entirety. Add 3 different things that you learned in this workshop. and that you can implement immediately tomorrow for those of you that are starting your week tomorrow, or Monday for those that are starting the week on Monday. So, very, very excited to have you all here today. And we will have a few different questions. And if you're on Facebook or if you're in the Zoom, we will take those questions now. One that I put down that I wanted to bring up during this time, that there are a couple people that asked this, Dr. Jennifer, is what type of test has more advantages compared to other tests? And which one should we use?
So I just want to go back there to what are you trying to measure? And so going back to your learning objectives, I think variety is important for students, but it really depends on what it is that you're trying to measure specifically. If my exams in my AP English classes looked very different than my exams in my remedial English classes, even though the standards may have been the same. And so it's just really trying to think about what it is that you want to measure. And then one of the things that I didn't use as an example today, but that I've thought about a lot in the last week or two, is also remembering that predictability is helpful to students in reducing some of their test anxiety. As a university professor, my students do a lot of projects and different assignments that aren't necessarily a paper and pencil test. But the university really likes for us to give an objective paper and pencil final exam the last week of the semester. And what I found was that test for them, for my students, even though I kept telling them, this is over all the information you've learned, you'll have a study guide, all of those things, it actually produced quite a bit of anxiety because they had never taken an objective test from me and didn't know what my tests look like, because we were doing papers and projects that they had rubrics that they could consult and other things. And I realized, oh, there does need to be some predictability in how we set things up. So it's this dichotomy, right? That variety is important, but so is predictability. And so figuring out what that looks like is kind of key for the classroom environment that you create with your students, and that respect and rapport with them, and talking with them about it, and asking them how they thought things went. Did the exams measure what they thought they were going to, or what you said that they would? And getting their feedback can be really important. So I think that the short answer is the perfect exam is the one that measures what it's supposed to measure reliably and accurately, and that students can walk away feeling confident. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. You know your students and your program the best, but if we keep those things in mind, that really is key.
That's good. And that probably dovetails well into the next comment and question is it depends on the subject area, what kind of test you want to use. There's a question for mathematics where multiple choice and true false questions isn't the best option. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. I was actually, as my husband was reading through my slides yesterday, he laughed and he said, "Well, you've got some math examples here, but they sure are nothing like the free response that usually happen in a typical math test." And so, to that, I would say that's probably a whole different workshop topic. However, I do feel like in two ways it is helpful thinking about SAT and even GRE later on and things like that for students to encounter some objective type questions having to do with math. However, I do feel like having them solve those and being able to see all of their work from the perspective of a teacher is a better way to measure learning. And so it's actually a little bit of a balance. I would definitely lean more towards free response, obviously, as being most important in math, but I do think it's helpful for students every once in a while to encounter some objective type questions, because they're going to see those on standardized tests, and with SAT and even advanced like GRE later on if you have students that go on in that way.
That's great. Another question from Clovis, a question about multiple choice questions. Sometimes when we make multiple choice questions, some of the multiple choices can be very similar, or they can be one is correct and one can be somewhat correct. And this can really confuse students. And we see this, I think, specifically in some standardized tests. Any thoughts or feedback on creating tests with those thoughts in mind?
I would just encourage you to do everything that you can to take the trickery out. And even when you don't think it's tricky, getting that feedback from someone that's proofread it or students over time can be really helpful to minimize that as much as possible. Um, Again, because we want to be able to celebrate learning with our students and not have those assessments be something that's stressful or afterwards that they feel like, oh man, that wasn't what I studied, or I was totally surprised because I wasn't expecting this. We really want to set them up for success absolutely as much as we can.
Great. And what kind of dovetails perfectly into this is a question, but that Mr. Tony just posted. Can you please comment on the practice of previewing rubrics with students prior to an assessment? Students should not be surprised by a rubric after writing their essay response.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think that you just hit the key point there. Rubric students, um, rubrics should not be a secret that the teacher keeps, right? Rubrics should be something that are shared with students prior to the assignment. With my college students now, the rubrics are built into to every assignment that they find on the LMS that we use. And we actually review some of those things together as a class. With the rubrics so they know what to expect. And then, by the way, make sure you don't change your rubric before you use it without students knowing. That becomes important too. Another thing that I found really helpful as an AP instructor was actually having my students get sample prompts and having them use the rubric. I mean, AP, the rubric is a little different than, or a lot different than I would actually use when I was scoring, but having them use the rubrics to analyze some of both really strong prompts and really weak prompts. So they got the opportunity to practice with them specifically. And that was really empowering for students. So rubrics should not be a secret. They should be reviewed with students as soon as the assignment is given. And then it's very helpful to have students complete some self-assessments as well, especially if it's a major project, to get an idea of how they think they scored before they turn it in. And sometimes that can be a talking point as part of writer's workshop or other things that they're doing before it's due, is actually having them do some self-reflection using the rubric. So again, so there are no surprises later on.
That's great. Uh, yeah, wonderful response. I think Mr. Tony really appreciates that. Najashi has a really good question. What is the difference between teacher-made tests and standardized tests? I think that's a good question.
Uh-huh. Yes.
People don't
So
know.
obviously the short answer is right, who is authoring that test. However, I would say that usually students find teacher-made tests much more student-friendly because it covers the things that were actually covered in that course or in that unit or in that chapter specifically. We tend to, in here in the US, standardized tests are required. Each state has to choose what standardized tests they use. And usually, standardized tests do give students some feedback as to their learning, but we tend here to use standardized testing much more for measuring school success and maybe district success, and as a point of comparison between different schools or different districts or different states that are using the same standardized test. We're also, for college admission, ACT and SAT are more standardized tests. And the style tends to be much more formal. The questions tend to be longer as far as what you read. And I know when I was, again, back to my English teacher days, I actually found it really helpful to teach a unit on preparing for the SAT or the ACT because we could still cover some of the same standards that we were required to cover by our state, but also to put it in the form of those standardized questions that students don't tend to encounter as often until they get to a more standardized setting. Specifically here it would be like fall and spring, and then those that would be compared, but then also for college admission or graduate school. And so that's kind of the terminology that when we use when we think of standardized testing versus teacher made testing. And usually it's the testing companies that are making those standardized tests.
Yeah,
Jennifer,
that's
you
great.
said something that I think is really important, and that is that the standardized tests, such as ACT, SAT, the state tests, and so forth, they're based to really compare schools against schools. And in the case of ACT and SAT, to get into college or university. And even though those can be very limiting, I think it's important for students to at least be exposed to those types of tests so that they know. I've had students who have come back from taking the SAT or whatever and said, "Oh, I wasn't prepared for answering questions the way they asked them." That was my fault as a teacher because students need to be exposed that not to the generalized type of exams that are more prevalent in standardized tests. So that's just a key point.
Mhm.
I like it. Another question was, how can we implement differentiation in exams to ensure that all students are successful and we focus on those exams with their differences?
This that might actually be a question for a whole nother workshop sometime as I'm
Yeah.
thinking
Yep.
about that one, because
Yeah.
there again, it all goes back to those learning objectives and the idea that there are different ways that those can be measured. And I was thinking, even I saw a question about first graders and tests, and of course in those situations an oral test may be very appropriate for them
Yeah.
depending on what it is that you're trying to measure. The same with our multilingual learners. As they get older too, they might be able to better express what they know and have learned orally and verbally compared to in writing, just because their language level may be stronger verbally than it is written form. And so it really just kind of depends on your level of student. But I would really always go back to what's your learning objective? Are there multiple ways that you can measure that? And it's okay. We have to let go of the idea that every student has to take the same tests. You can give students different ways of expressing their understanding. And that may be much more accurate as far as a measure of learning than giving everyone exactly the same test.
And you said that about first grade as you saw that question come up on the chat. There's another question about kindergarten and probably primary grades is how can we best assess them and make it so it's not so stressful?
Oh, yes. That is so, I think, so important. And so much of it goes back to that classroom environment and trying to. So, I was an elementary school counselor, and I know that the ways in which teachers approach tests and even their body language and their tone when they talk about those tests, though that information is really conveyed to students in ways in which we can't even fathom. If a test is going to be fun, hey, we've got something coming up, I can't wait to see how well you do. Just approaching it in that manner, students tend to think, oh, okay, well, this will be fun, and this is a good way for me to show what I've learned, as opposed to, oh, we've got another test today. My teacher doesn't want to give it to us today either, and we're going to lose some recess time if we take too long, and all of those things. So the short answer to that is classroom environment, ways in which the teacher sets students up for success. And then also just thinking about what are some fun things that you can do, even like stretches or some fun things to get students ready to take a test. And obviously at younger grades, it should be a much shorter test than we see at at later grades specifically. But the short answer is the teacher approach can make all of the difference. So find ways to make things fun for students, and believe it or not, but they're going to get on board and feel like it's fun too to be learning and showing off what they've learned.
That's awesome. Well, let's finish off with just this one question from Ahmed Ali. How can data from teacher-made assessments be used to improve instruction and student performance? He said specifically in mathematics, but I think this is a question that could be applied to all subject areas.
Yes, definitely. If you can give me just a second and let me pull something out of a closet
Sure.
actually along those lines. So we talked a little bit about item analysis, and in my methods course, I actually show them going through different class periods. So this is an example that I received from my husband in math specifically, but going through, this is for a final exam, how many students missed different problems. And then the analysis over here, you can see the top problems that were missed and analyzing what that was specifically. I don't have, these are not magical cabinets. I don't have everything I can pull out, but that was such a great question. But analyzing though, then that's something that you can really do as a department if you have multiple math teachers, or if you're the only math teacher, this gives you some good feedback. What types of questions are my students missing and why are they missing them? Now, this item analysis comes from an objective test. And so it could be, do we need to look back at the wording of that question? It could be, do I need to make sure that the key is correct, that I haven't missed something there? Or it also could be, this is a really high level of blooms where I'm trying to distinguish those that really know versus those that only somewhat know or understand the content. So it's not bad to have difficult questions in there as long as you're placing them there on purpose. And then you can articulate why it is that some students are missing them and others are not. And so that's, I think item analysis is really helpful, especially in math, in looking at those types of questions. Sometimes it could be, we were talking about, Dr. Ray said how much students are exposed to questioning types. Maybe they've never seen a question like that before. And if that's the case, then how can I think about in my curriculum embedding that earlier on so they have some opportunities to practice with those types of questions, and seeing them on the final exam is not the very first time that they've seen it.
Great. Well, a lot of good questions. I think everyone has had an opportunity to get to the link and finish the survey, or we'll have some time to finish the survey. So we thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you on March 21st at our next workshop. If there's anything that Array Global Accreditation can do to help and support you or your school, or if you're interested in accreditation, please reach out and talk to us. But again, just one big round of applause and a big thank you to Dr. Jennifer for coming in and presenting on this weekend. So thank you again, and appreciate everyone, and great work in the classroom, and keep up the great work.
Blessings to all of you. Thanks so much for being here today.